There you go. We got the word. You're on, Robby.
Morning, everybody. Yeah, as Dave said, it's a pleasure to share with you all this morning. I was thinking about what to share today, and for my first time sharing at this group, I decided to just keep it fairly simple and just share with you my testimony. So this is a high overview story of my life, the highs and the lows, which I will kind of detail for you guys this morning. So yeah, it's a privilege to do this. One thing as a aside, one reason that I find it really cool to share my testimony is I was baptized in, I think it was 7th grade. And at the time I had pornography was deeply ingrained in my life, and I was super ashamed of where I was. And so usually when you get baptized, you share your testimony, you share about yourself and what has brought you to this step. And I couldn't do that. I was literally, I knew I wanted to be baptized, but I literally couldn't share my story. I was like so like afraid and stuff like that. And so the people who baptized me, they allowed me to do so anyway. But I always felt quite ashamed that I couldn't share my story. I couldn't share what God had done in my life. And so what I've found since then is that I've noticed that God has used, or God has given me opportunities to make up for not sharing my testimony at that time. And so I've shared my testimony in many environments, in many ways, some of which you'll hear about today. But this again is for me one more way of, and I don't want to make it like into a something where I messed up in a huge way, but I'm privileged that I get to share this morning, be open with you guys, and talk about who I am and kind of where my life has kind of taken me. So yeah, so for me, it's always a great pleasure to be able to share my story, and it's one way of just representing and publicly declaring my faith in God and my need for a savior. So yeah, so I will get into it now. So the first section of my story I will label as the first down, and there's actually a down and an up, and then a down and an up in my story. And so we'll start off. So yeah, just briefly first, hi, my name is Robby, and I'm a grateful believer in Jesus Christ, who used to primarily struggle with pornography and masturbation, and now primarily struggles with lust and adulterous ideations. I'd like to share with you a brief overview of my life and how I fell into addiction, but more importantly, how God has lifted me out and is continuing to do so, because it's not a finished work. It is my hope that the brokenness and the healing that you hear about in my story may resonate and inspire you in your own journey. I was born in 1988 to missionary parents who lived first in Pakistan for 13 years, which is where I was born, and then in Thailand for 4 years. And we would return to Canada every 2 to 3 years for a furlough. All of our extended family is in Ontario, and we now live in BC. My parents were linguistically trained Bible translators, seeking to enable minority groups to translate the Bible into their own mother tongue. They worked with Wycliffe Bible translators, and yeah, they went out to the mission field looking to do a lot of translation work to translate the Bible into a variety of languages. In the end, they had a bit of a different focus, and they ended up training nationals in linguistic skills so they could go back to their villages and their homes, create languages in many places where they didn't even have a language. And so they kind of changed their tact into more of a teaching role. But yeah, so they've been career missionaries their whole lives and still are, actually. It was during my time in Pakistan that I was first exposed to pornographic magazines and videos at the age of 7 by a Pakistani neighborhood boy who was a friend of mine. This same boy also told me about masturbation and inappropriately touched myself and another boy on one occasion. I never told my parents about these events, at least until many years later, as I was scared and I knew that what I had seen did not fit with the Christian world that I was living in. This was the beginning of my addiction, and my choice to keep these events a secret made me emotionally and spiritually sick. Unfortunately, my situation had to get far better before it could get any worse. Once I was aware of pornography and sexuality in general, it was a door that could never be closed. I became obsessed with women, and the female body became an idol in my mind, which I so badly wanted to attain. In spite of going to Christian schools and being around a faith culture, I continued to be educated incorrectly by my peers when it comes to sexuality and believing myths and fake truths about that, and yearned to be in a relationship, but was not attractive to the girls around me at the time. This frustrated me, but also made me yearn still more to be in a relationship. Fantasy and masturbation became my drug, which I spent huge amounts of time on whenever I was not engaged in another activity. In 2001, following the events of 9/11, our family was forced to return to Canada as it was no longer safe to live in Pakistan. It was here, with the availability of the internet, that a good friend of mine and I first looked up pornography and realized just how easy it was to access on the internet. In 2002, my family were returned to Pakistan, but then went through a traumatic incident in which our school was attacked. I was a boarding school that I was attending at the time, and it was attacked and had to be shut down. And so we were forced to relocate to Thailand as a family. Thailand was an amazing place to live and experience my high school years in, but it also presented me with additional opportunities for my struggles to grow. Internet was much more readily accessible than it was in Pakistan, and my ability to access computers was again much more open. And Thailand being a very free country, there was a lot more, I guess, sexual influences around me and stuff like that. Computers were a constant presence in my family home, and with the availability of the internet, I learned how to access it without being caught by my parents, and my addiction really started to take off. Once this door was opened, it led to a dam burst, and I started to spend as much unsupervised time on the computer as I could. I did end up getting caught on a couple occasions by my parents, and I think they acted well in terms of, outlining the importance and the fact that that was not okay. But I just continued to find ways around it, and I just acted very antagonistically towards my parents every time they tried to put boundaries in place. Also, I should say during this time, because of the amount of shame and guilt I had and the secrets I was holding, I became super bitter towards my family and super distant and not wanting to be connected to them, because I knew there was a foil between what I knew was the lifestyle I should have and what I was living. And so especially in high school, middle school, this time, my relationship with my family was very, very rocky and poor. I continued to keep my struggles a secret, and I developed a cycle of mood and behavior that fed the addiction. I would feel ashamed. I would go to pornography. I would feel ashamed again, and I would go back to pornography, very similar to the PMO cycle that Dave talks about. I talked to a couple of my friends about my struggles in a general way, and while they had some similar struggles, they could not relate fully to the magnitude of my problem. When I would share it with them, they would kind of react and be like, "Oh, wow, that's really bad." And that would again lead me to further shame and feeling like I was different than everybody else, which then always led me to more pornography, more masturbation, etc. During the end of high school, I met a girl who liked me and I liked her. While I wanted to be in a relationship with her, I could not bring myself to officially date her because of the shame that I felt due to my ongoing sexual behaviors. I told myself that being a friend with benefits was better, and so I misled and mistreated her, all while avoiding the responsibility of a relationship. At this point, I graduated high school and we moved to Abbotsford, with me in a very dark place emotionally and spiritually. I did not want to be in Canada, and in my foolish and immature angst, I resented my parents for moving us, even though it made perfect sense when I look back at it now. When you're a missionary kid and you kind of graduate, there's kind of a splitting of ways. And so all my friends from America, Australia, England, they all go back to their homes, right? And so our home was Canada, and so we moved back home. So at the time, I just wanted to be with them, and I didn't really want to come back to a place I didn't know. So a year later, I started going to Trinity Western University in Langley and eventually met a woman there who agreed to date me, a fellow student. She was very strict and legalistic in her faith due to some serious traumas in her past. And we quickly started to drift apart even while we were in a relationship. I again made the mistake of not confessing my struggles to her. And so when the truth came out, it was devastating to her, and the relationship ended at that point. A few years later, after graduating, just later, I met another woman outside of school, and we very quickly became infatuated with one another as we went through a very traumatic experience together. I loved her very much, and it was during this time that I was actually able to get 3 months of consecutive clean time, just because I was motivated to make things work and not because I had gotten into recovery yet. In the end, however, I did slip back into old behaviors, and the truth came out, and this broke her heart, and she ended our dating relationship. This began the darkest time in my life, where I considered suicide and was absolutely unhappy with the life that I had created for myself. It was here, however, that God met me and began a healing work within me. I realized I had a problem that was not going to go away and which I had become powerless over. So now's the second heading is the first up. So that was kind of the first down into getting into really a dark place. And this is where things start to turn around. A quote that I like a lot is, only when your pain is greater than your fear are you able to take the first step. I was now at this place and ready to surrender my life to God. Around this same time, the church that I attend, Seven Oaks Alliance Church in Abbotsford, realized that the community around it had changed considerably. While the church was once on the outskirts of town and was somewhat isolated from the greater community, it started to see that individuals experiencing homelessness and addictions were all around it. The church therefore felt the need to address this by starting a support group that could assist individuals experiencing addictions. Two members of our church, John and Linda Driedger, who worked with what was Campus Crusade for Christ and then later became Power to Change, were asked to run this group, as John had previously had an alcohol addiction in his 20s and 30s and had experienced a dramatic recovery while also meeting God during that time. They also became later on, or they were for many years, missionaries as well, serving in Russia and Siberia, but they had come back home. They therefore started a Celebrate Recovery group, which would later change its name and become the Addiction Recovery Ministry, or ARM as it's referred to. As I was attending Seven Oaks, that was our kind of church that we had gravitated to when we moved here. I had heard about ARM and that it was meant to be a support to those with addictions. At this point, I realized that perhaps I had an addiction, and as my pride had been broken, I decided to go and see what it was all about. I first came to ARM in 2010 and was scared away the first time I went because a youth pastor was there leading worship. And as I did not want to be known as having an addiction, I left immediately when I saw him. A week or two later, however, I came back, though, as I realized I needed to be there. And even that one instance changed the way we operate at ARM. ARM has become a place where, you know, you go if you have an addiction, but if you want to help out, if you want to play some worship, you know, we appreciate that, but it's just not welcome because we really feel that anonymity is important. Just like, you know, many of us on this call perhaps might not, if we're not already known anyway, we might not want to have a bunch of people that don't know us and our struggles be on this call, right? So we changed some things so that people would feel safe and comfortable being there. At ARM, I shared my struggles. I adopted an attitude of brutal honesty and realized that I had an unmanageable addiction to pornography. I realized at this point that if I was serious about not hurting any other women in the future, I needed to do some major work in my life. I promised God that I would give him as much time as he needed to work with me before I pursued any relationships again. Since that time, it has been very rare to not see me at ARM on a Monday night. We meet in person every Monday night of the year at the church, rain or shine, pandemic or not, and that continues to this day. Addiction does not take a break, and so neither do we. I met John and Linda Driedger, and John encouraged me to get a sponsor. I did so within the first 3 months, and a man called Abe later became my sponsor and then my accountability partner and mentor. I should say that at ARM, we have these two different roles that we talk about, which is the accountability partner and a sponsor. An accountability partner is somebody who we are connected with. They're on a similar part in the journey of recovery. And so we can share openly with them, but they're kind of more of a listening ear as opposed to somebody that then teaches us or speaks into our life. They're kind of just there to share their experience and be a listening ear. Whereas a sponsor is somebody who's always, you know, a step or two ahead, at least in recovery, and is basically taking on more of a teaching, calling you on your crap kind of role. And so at ARM, we have one sponsor and then a multitude of accountability partners. So a sponsor is somebody that, you know, goes over your steps with you. They go over every step with you. They talk about it. They encourage you. They direct you, you know, maybe what you should try next in terms of growing in your recovery. So yeah, so just so you know what those terms mean, that's what they are. When I first joined ARM, there was actually no sexual addiction group. At the time, John was had recovered from drugs and alcohol, and so that was his expertise. And so I asked if I could start a sexual addiction group. At ARM, we have two parts to our meeting. We have a first group, which is a larger open meeting where everybody sits in chairs and, we'll sing a couple songs and then have some recovery lesson or open sharing testimony time. And then we move into small groups where it's issue specific. You meet with up to 8 guys and you talk about, what's been going on for you this week and kind of any questions related to the talk that was given earlier that day. So that's kind of how we do it. So there was no breakout group related to sexual addiction when I joined, but I asked if we could start one. And yeah, John agreed on the condition that I run the group and join their leadership team, which I did. John was a huge encouragement to me and gave me what I would call aggressive compliments. Any opportunity he could from the mic or anywhere, he would talk about how he saw leadership potential in me and took every opportunity to build me up. And that was super important at the time, just to have somebody, I guess, see things in me that I couldn't see in myself at the time, see opportunities, see strengths that I couldn't see then. I later actually moved into John and Linda's house and lived there on my own for 5 years. During that time, I realized I had to make some changes in terms of how I lived. And as computers were my main source of temptation, I quickly realized that I could not have a computer in my home and use it wisely. And so I moved my computer back to my family's home where I would go and visit so that I could play video games and stuff when I wanted to in a supervised area. Another member of the group by the name of Dustin became an accountability partner for me and later became my sponsor when I changed away from Abe. Together, Dustin, Abe, and I started one of the very first step groups at ARM, where together as a group, we all worked on the steps. And later we each went on to run our own separate groups, leading others through the steps as well. Part of doing the steps involves creating what's called a step 4 inventory list and then sharing it with your sponsor, at least the way we do it. This was life-changing for me when I did my first step 4 inventory, as I was able to share the darkest things I had ever done with my sponsor and pray to God, asking him to remove the shame of those actions forever. Another part of the step process involved making amends in step 8. And this was also life-changing to apologize to my family, my friends, and a couple of the women from my past for hurting and mistreating them in various ways. John would always encourage the participants at ARM to keep coming back. He would say, keep coming back and the miracle will happen. Encouragements like this kept me going, as recovery was not a simple journey and took many years. I got involved in any way that I could at ARM, and eventually an opportunity became available to go to Cuba with John and Linda and Abe to share my recovery testimony with hundreds of people during a ARM training that, with the Cuban church. Our church had a connection with the Cuban Alliance Church, and they had asked if some representatives could come over and share, because addiction is also rampant in a place like Cuba, lots of alcoholism and lots of marital unfaithfulness. So we went over there to kind of teach others how to run ARM-like groups. And so I was able to go with that. And that was, again, a huge privilege to be able to share my testimony in front of hundreds of Cuban believers over there. Struggles with pornography became fewer while attending ARM and less intense, but I was never actually able to get more than 6 months clean during about a 5-year span. God made some massive changes in my heart and in my ability to take responsibility, but my masturbation and pornography behaviors did not end. I had the foundation and I knew the skills, but I needed a final piece to help me put it all into action. John, again, often talked about the importance of having people around us who could be Jesus with skin on, as a physical representative of his love for us. And I should share, at ARM, we have a little bit of a different, I guess, flavor. Obviously, we come into it as, it's all volunteers. It's all just come and drop in as you go. I guess more like an AA meeting would be. And so for me, as a single man, I guess there was an extended period of time where I continued with my pornography behaviors and my masturbation behaviors. Again, it got better, but it didn't go fully away, but there was a huge amount of character development and things going on behind the scenes that was going on. And I have found that in my time at ARM, there isn't always a drop off of the behaviors, unfortunately, but there is massive growth internally. And so I always look for that in people that are attending that group and this group as well, because yeah, sometimes the addiction we've been in has been around so long that it takes a long time to fully get it out of our system. So it was at this point, 5 years into recovery journey, that a beautiful woman showed up in my life and became this Jesus with skin on for me. She was a real goal that I could see and pursue, and she was the motivation I needed to help me put the aforementioned skills and tools in place to stay away from pornography and masturbation. I shared a basic overview of my testimony with her on our second date, and while it was very hard for her to hear my story and know where I was still at, she felt that God was not closing the door on our relationship. We got to know each other, started dating, and quickly fell in love. Fast forward 5 years, and we are now joyfully married, though we have walked through some very dark challenges on our journey, which I will talk about. So yeah, as soon as I met her, even before, I think a week or two before, I ceased my masturbation and pornography behaviors, and that continued. So for me, I kind of needed that. Yeah, it had been 5 years of learning, theoretically what I was supposed to do, but then having that evidence in front of me, like, hey, this is what I could actually work for and actually earn, in a sense, was what I needed to kind of carry me the rest of the way. So now, unfortunately, this is where my second down starts as kind of a heading. Our marriage has been filled with joy, but also great pain and darkness. Unfortunately, recovery did not end for me when I got married, but instead showed me a lot of other dark parts of my heart that still needed healing. Looking back on our wedding night, the first time that we were naked and intimate together, I can see that my idea of what a woman should look like and act like had been hugely tainted by my years of pornography and led to a massive shock for me. As I mentioned earlier, I'd idolized women in general, and now specifically my wife, and made them to be the highest symbol of achievement that I could see in my life. This space should have only ever been occupied by God, but I had made an idol of a created thing, which could never live up to my expectations. While I now had a wife and a sexual partner, there was a huge disparity between what I thought women were into sexually and what my wife was interested in. Even on our wedding night, sadly, a huge seed of doubt was placed in my mind, which asked me, did I make a huge mistake in getting married? This seed nagged and grew in my mind as we walked forward in our marriage. It was further fed by two things, which were the pressures of deciding whether we should, one, have children, and two, me talking to other men regarding what their sexual lives was, and then comparing that to ours. I've never had a burning desire to have children, and as my wife is older than me, the question has always been there from the beginning. This question always led me to think about whether I wanted to have children, and unfortunately led me to question whether I wanted to have children with her when at the time I had so many issues with our marriage and kind of our sexuality together. And this made me contemplate whether we were meant to be together and whether God had, led me in the right direction. This, along with surveying other men that I knew regarding what their sexual lives were like, led me to create a huge resentment against my wife, which led to a growing lack of interest and care for her. A little over a year ago, this dam finally burst. During an argument, I revealed that I did not think I loved my wife anymore, as I did not want to have children with a woman who I felt didn't love me in the way that I kind of wanted to be loved. Shortly thereafter, I spent a weekend at my parents' house and then returned home, only to live in our second bedroom in a separated state. This led to a few months of very dark times. I was very angry at my wife, and she was understandably heartbroken by what I had said and revealed. My heart had been breaking ever since our wedding night, based on just a difference of expectations of what I thought things would be like. And so I told myself that I was justified in my proceeding towards a permanent separation and eventually a divorce. Thankfully, here's where the second up starts. During this time, the head pastor of our church asked if we would be willing to go and see a local counselor by the name of Dave Currie, who specialized in working with Christian couples, but also those struggling with sexual addiction. I agreed to do so, and I told God that it would be up to him to show me clearly if my wife and I were supposed to be together or not through this process. I was initially resentful of Dr. Dave and my wife, as they both seemed to suggest that a big problem in our marriage was my addiction. I could not accept this at the time because I had been clean from pornography and masturbation since before my wife and I had met. I was able to maintain that through my own devices, and I had made lines in the sand where I wasn't going to cross those ones. though once, my wife and I were in this separated kind of state, then I did start masturbating again, usually about once a week. I'd had about 5 years of clean time from masturbation at this point, and I used that as a crutch to support my arguments. Our sessions were initially quite painful and seemingly unfruitful, as my wife and I held strong perspectives that were, and we were not really able to find common ground and compromise just yet. Dave invited me to join ReGroup, and I grudgingly decided to join. Through my exposure to people like Kevin Enns and others, I came to realize that others had far more aggressive boundaries in place than I had. They had been able to, not look at just pornography and masturbation as the line, but they kind of backed it up many layers back from that. You see, for me, I'd been able to avoid masturbation for 5 years and any kind of softcore or hardcore pornography, but I allowed in pretty much everything else. Surfing Instagram accounts of attractive women, check. Watching YouTube videos of women at the beach, check. Openly checking out any and all women in public, check. Watching movies with nudity or sex scenes, check. I realized that while I may not have crossed the boundary I had set for myself, I had set my boundaries in a place where I was still receiving a huge amount of unhelpful images that was further enabling my feelings of resentment and ungratefulness towards my wife that God had given me as a good gift. I came to realize that my addiction was alive and well, but had just taken on a new face that I no longer had recognized. I stopped recognizing it as my enemy, and I instead welcomed it as a friend and allowed it to poison my mind. Around this time, so I guess I should stop there and say, yeah, this led me to, reevaluate those boundaries and realize that, I couldn't say I was actually clean for 5 years, because there had been all these other things that were seeping in that led me to get real close to the addiction, even if I didn't, or real close to the behaviors, I guess, because the addiction was still alive. And so this was a wake-up call for me. Around this time, my wife and I had a life-changing conversation. While I had a lot of issues, which I was coming to realize that we both were responsible for, my wife and I, my wife on her side had been was commonly acting very harshly and uncaringly towards me, but she humbled herself and she apologized to me for her part in our broken marriage. She told me she wanted to change in the ways that she knew she needed to, and asked if we could take our marriage one day at a time and see if we could rebuild it again. I was shocked by this and floored, and I felt that God had answered my prayers of whether asking him to show me whether this was meant to be. And it seemed like he answered those prayers in that moment. I agreed to continue in our marriage, and it has been almost a year now. And I honestly am so happy and content in my marriage now. I feel like we've had a whole new lease in our marriage that we never had the opportunity for before, because of where I was at kind of mentally. I feel like our marriage has started all over again, and we have a chance to make it as always should have been. While both of us are far from perfect, and we still have a lot to grow in as individuals and a married couple, there is not the same cloud of resentment and emotional distance hanging over me that led to so many unhealthy behaviors. Since that time, my heart has been opened by God towards the topic of children even, and we are now exploring that option with God to see what he has in store for us. Regardless of what he leads us to, I know that he will continue to be with us on our journey together. So yeah, some final thoughts. So at ARM, we actually have attached each of the 12 steps of AA to 12 Bible verses that kind of go well with them and kind of speak a similar theme. Two of them that I will read here, two of the Bible verses that attach to two of the steps, I'm going to read here briefly just because I find them really helpful. One is, if we confess our sins, he, God, is faithful and will forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness. 1 John 1:9. And that verse was huge for me and still is, but especially at ARM, like I shared, I took on a brutal honesty, I guess, and that's gone with me till today. The act of confession has been just such a huge life-changing experience for me. Again, going through sharing my step 4s with another person and God. Anytime I get an opportunity to confess a sin like that, I just find it just breaks that weight and that chain that's attached to it. And so it's been a huge thing for me and for others that I've seen. And a second verse is, for it is God who is at work in you to will and to act according to his good purpose, Philippians 2:13. This also was such an encouragement for me, because when I think about it as, God who's working, in my mind, it's more just me getting out of his way and letting him do his work. And that makes it easier, because obviously when I think of the gulf, especially early on in recovery, when I think of the gulf of the change that needs to happen between where I was at and where I wanted to go, I couldn't see any legitimate way for me to make that happen, right? But when, I look at a verse like that, and it's God in me that's good, that's going to be doing the work, and he just, wants me to allow him to do the work he wants to do. It just makes it so much more doable in my mind. So for me, first attending ARM, and now ReGroup as well, has been so huge in my recovery, and my life is forever changed for the better for being a part of both these groups. I would encourage each of you, like Dave shared really excellently right at the beginning, and it fits really well here. I would encourage each of you to make the most of your time in these groups and allow God to mold and shape you while fully engaging with the program that you're a part of. And yeah, if you're willing to give God access to every area of his life, he will do a miracle. And if you keep coming back, if you keep doing the work. But like Dave shared, if whatever parts of your life you don't give to him, he can't work in those areas. And so for me, I had large chunks of my life, even in recovery, that I realized recently coming to ReGroup that I still was holding on to. So yeah, I would just encourage each of you to be bold and to be brave and courageous in terms of giving him all areas of life. But I will say too, recovery is a journey and it's a process, and God, like every part of our lives, he reveals to us over time areas that we're still forgetting, right? I know when I've encouraged others in their step 4, in their going through their inventory and sharing what they've done, you write down everything that God puts on your mind, right? And for me, I've done the steps about 6 or 7 times now. And so each time I do my step 4, I'm writing down new things that God's putting on my mind. So it's not like it's a one and done thing, and it has to be forever, done perfectly the first time. But whatever God puts on our mind, that's what we need to be confessing, and that's what we need to be, giving to him, right? But God will put more things on our mind over time. So yeah, thank you all for the small, thank you all for your role, big and small, in my recovery, because truly, we wouldn't attend these groups if nobody came to them. We wouldn't come to ARM on Monday nights if nobody came to it. So it's important, just the fact that each of us are here, each of us are on a screen. And so my hope is that my story may play out in a similar way to yours, and maybe encouragement for you. Just know that God never gives up on you, and he will always make his grace and strength available to anyone who calls on him. So thank you. And that is my story.
Wow.